Newstalk 1540 KXEL is where Iowa comes to talk. Good morning. The Iowa City Beer Mafia is the subject of a new novel by Iowa writer S.C. Sherman. The story of a clash between alcohol interests and prohibition proponents is set in a time you might not expect. This morning we find out more about the historic fight over beer in eastern Iowa from our guest, author S.C. Sherman. Thank you for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I think most people hear anything about prohibition or temperance versus alcohol. They think the 1920s and 30s. Let's start by talking about when this book is set. It's much earlier than that.
That's right, it is. The book takes place roughly between 1881 and 1884. And Iowa was one of the few states, Kansas and Maine, I believe, are the other two, that actually did a full prohibition in the 1880s, almost 30 years prior to the federal prohibition. And it was kind of the forerunner.
How much of what happened in that era would then be repeated in the wider nationwide prohibition?
Well, quite a bit actually. They could have learned a lot if they'd have watched what happened in Iowa in those years. The reason the book's exciting, it was full of drama and angst, anger, illegal activity, protesting, violence, and eventually it failed. The prohibition failed, which what would happen nationally. But it took us a decade nationally to figure it out. I believe it's from 1919 to about 1930 when it finally was repealed. But yeah, it didn't go well here either, and it didn't go well nationally at all.
There was conflict between the folks who wanted prohibition
Mhm.
of alcohol. Was there also some conflict between the different brewers among themselves? Because there were several, and they all had different heritages.
Correct. No, the Iowa City story is definitely it was really heavily Czech and German and Irish, the north side of Iowa City, and the Germans had brought their brewing, technology as it was from their homeland and brought it to America, and relaunched it. The Englert Brewery was German. The City Brewery, which was that was owned by a Czech, Dostal, and then the Union Brewery, which was also owned by Graf, another German. They were in happy competition, just like the brewers now. Each one saying they were the best, and they had their own bar on site, and they served people. And then they competed, but I don't think they were really angry competitors, just kind of like business peers. And then when the prohibition activists came, they really bound together and became friends, and as they fought a common threat um, in prohibition.
We're talking with novelist S.C. Sherman. His latest book, just out this spring, is called Beer Money, A Tale of the Iowa Beer Mafia, and it looks back on a clash in the 1880s between proponents of beer, mainly immigrants from Central and Western Europe, and prohibitionists who wanted to see beer outlawed and did get that accomplished for a time. When we think back to that era of temperance, Carrie Nation comes to mind. You mentioned Kansas was another place where
Mhm.
that movement was able to achieve some of its objectives. Were there events that were as dramatic as we think of with Carrie Nation going into bars with an axe and chopping up the bar and that sort of event? Or who were the people on the other side opposing the so-called beer mafia?
Absolutely. I have what became a fictional character that's really modeled after Carrie Nation, Bernice Armstrong in my book. She was part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was the driving force trying to outlaw alcohol in all ways. And I never could really pin down the exact character that lived in Iowa City, but I know there had to been someone like that character. So that's what makes it a fiction. And she was modeled much after the Carrie Nation character. And there was a lot of violence, just like she did, marching into bars with axes. In our situation, they were breaking out the windows, marching in the streets with signs, using political power at the state level, at the county level, these sheriffs, everybody to try to outlaw alcohol in any way that they could. Of course, then the guys who became known as the mafia pushed back pretty heavily against that.
You mentioned doing the research into this character that you've created, sort of a composite Bernice Armstrong.
Mhm.
Interested in your research and what you found, what you didn't find. Were there frustrations as you tried to get information about people on that side of the issue? Because the coverage, I'm guessing, wasn't quite what we expect from news coverage today.
Right. We didn't have wall-to-wall news like we have now, but there was surprisingly a lot of news. There were a lot of newspapers that have come and gone. There were German newspapers, Czech newspapers, which they called Bohemian back then. Czech is a much more modern term. So they really covered it pretty well. It was very politically slanted, just like nowadays. I mean, depending on which paper you read, you were getting a political slant. And researching it was good in the fact that there was a lot of that out there, but it also, yeah, was vague. Like you could find the names of the groups, but you never could really find out which one was pushing it. You could find out the violent events that happened, but of course, no one took full credit for it. So you had to piece it together a little bit. There was a really violent thing that happened over on the river near just south of Davenport, where a guy was still selling beer after the prohibition, and the peaceful side of the Christian temperance group went over and burned him down, beat him so bad that he was paralyzed and he eventually died. Well, they were only people that took credit for it were the Sons of Temperance, which was kind of was a guys group. The women's group was really the driving force, and they were supposedly peaceful. But then the Sons of Temperance kind of were the violent wing of it, and they didn't really take credit. They kind of slid under the radar, and so I couldn't firmly credit some of that, and so you had to sort of piece it together, much like you would now. And
Well, it's interesting too that the violence came
mhm,
from the side that, again, if we're talking about prohibition of the 20s and 30s, you think
mhm.
of violence related to the mob and the people who were
Right.
supplying the alcohol, and in this case, it was the other direction.
Yeah, and it actually ended up being both sides by the end. Like the book is written with the brewers and the mafia guys kind of as the protagonists. I mean, it's hard not to love these guys. They're immigrants. They come to America. They brew beer. I mean, what's not to love? But by the end of the story, you're not sure who's the good guy or the bad guy. They all get dirty, kind of like in lots of violence. You're just at the end of the day, it hurts everybody's cause.
We're talking with novelist S.C. Sherman about his latest book, Beer Money, A Tale of the Iowa Beer Mafia. It's just out, and this is your latest work delving into historical fiction. Always interested in talking with authors who write about history, but with a fictional spin about how you try to balance those two things. Telling a story that's based in a historical setting, but with some elements that make it a better story.
Absolutely. That's what I love about historical fiction. You still have a little bit of a fictional license to create, but I do take it pretty seriously. I don't want to overly fictionalize it. I mean, when writing a fiction story, you can kind of be as bombastic as you want. With a historical, I kind of want to keep the story as close to the truth as possible, but then show the dramatic side of it, the emotions, what people went through, what they felt, which you would sometimes miss just reading a straight history book. You get the dates of birth, death, this battle happened, this happened. But the drama of it is these people were human beings just like us. I mean, sure, it was the 1880s and they didn't have electricity or indoor plumbing, but they had traveled the world on ships, come to America, found this great place in the middle of Iowa, started a business, became wildly successful, had children, families, all many things you would see, today. And then when the government comes to take it away, they would feel the same way we feel, and they pushed back.
Along the same lines, there's a lot of echoes in
Hmm.
this story that are very familiar in our time. There's a conflict between immigrants and folks who have been in the country longer. There's a conflict on social lines that I think we can
Hmm.
all appreciate with some of the political conflicts that are in the public discourse today.
Hmm.
Is that something that you want to seep in, or is it something that you try to keep out? Some of the lens that we might look at this story through from our perspective on today's events.
Yeah, no, I didn't try to keep any of that out because I do believe history repeats itself, and human nature has obviously not changed a whole lot. In 100 years, we just have a lot more technology. I found an amazing article. I can't even remember what a newspaper article written about the German brewers ripping them apart. racially as a group. They're horrible human beings. We shouldn't have let them in America. They're letting their kids drink. They're on and on, calling them the goth horde, name calling, racial profiling, everything you'd see now that we see with different races. Sure, they really work hard, but we shouldn't have let them in our country because they're ruining it. And it's funny that 100 years later, you'd never have a clue even who's German and who's Czech, as the melting pot melted everyone in. But definitely, they were racially and politically and religiously, because they were mostly Catholics, uh, divided at the time. And it as I read it, it was comforting and also horrible. Horrible that we haven't really changed much, but comforting that they survived it and got through it, and we probably will too.
Well, coming up later this week, in coordination with the National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library, there's a virtual book signing. It'll be on Thursday from 6 until 8 o'clock. And just give us the background. What is a virtual book signing? We're adjusting to all sorts of new things. This is one of them.
Yeah, it is definitely a strange new world, isn't it, with the virtual everything. Well, it's going to be set at the National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library in Cedar Rapids, and we're going to be set up in the front driveway. And basically, people can go online now and purchase a package where they'll get a copy of my book, and they'll also get other options depending on which level of money they want to put in. They'll get invited to a really great video history lesson from Doug Alberhasky, who owns John's Grocery in Iowa City. Great historian in his own right. He's going to do, I believe, kind of a PowerPoint that he does in person generally, but he's going to do it over, I believe, Zoom or some type of online method. And that'll be really fun to do that. You also get credits, different amounts of credit to actually go buy beer at his store. So if you did that in advance, you could buy, drink a beer while you're learning about beer history. And then on the drive-through thing from 6 to 8 would be actually driving through. I'll be out there. We'll be all socially, distant, but we'll still be signing books. You bring the book that you got in advance. I'll sign it, and we can talk. I'm sure everyone will be masked, and we'll be safe as we can be. But it's going to be really fun, I think.
And I should clarify, different term that we've been using a lot lately, a social distancing book signing rather than a virtual book signing.
Right. The virtual part will be the history thing, which Doug would normally love to do in a big group in person, but he'll do it online. So maybe many more people will watch it actually than even in person, which is really fun because he talks about the caves that are still in Iowa City that were built by our brewers down under what's now the La James Hairstyle building. Was the only brewery that remains. There are caves 25, 30 feet under the ground that you can go down and visit. Well, carefully. They're not real overly accessible. Beautiful buildings built by these immigrants down under the ground where it stays 55 to 60 degrees year round, and they could store beer down there, kind of a geothermal thing. Amazing technology for the 1880s. And some of it still remains. He'll talk about all that. He'll talk about the brewers that are in my book, and it'll be good. And then get the book, read it. It's great history of our whole area, Johnson County, mostly Linn County, and then also the whole state. And yeah, come by and I'll still sign the book in person, but we'll be safe about it.
Well, again, the social distancing book signing is at 6 o'clock on Thursday at the National Czech and Slovak Museum and Library. The book is Beer Money, a tale of the Iowa beer mafia, and novelist S.C. Sherman has been our guest this morning. Thanks for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
This is the station where Iowa comes to talk. Newstalk 1540 KXEL.